Dr. Marcus Williams had spent 15 years building the museum's Renaissance collection, but he'd never been treated like he didn't belong in his own exhibition. When the new tour guide started explaining his paintings to him, Marcus realized it was time for an impromptu art history lesson.
Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and a comment before we start to learn more about what happened.
The Metropolitan Museum of Fine Arts stood majestically on Fifth Avenue, its limestone facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside, the Renaissance wing buzzed with the quiet energy of art lovers, students, and tourists exploring one of the world's most prestigious collections. Dr. Marcus Williams walked through the familiar halls with the measured pace of someone who knew every painting, every sculpture, every historical detail by heart. At 45, he had dedicated his entire career to Renaissance art, earning his Ph.D. from Yale and spending the last 15 years as the museum's chief curator. Today, however, he wasn't dressed in his usual suit and tie. Instead, he wore jeans, a casual button-down shirt, and comfortable walking shoes. Marcus was conducting his monthly anonymous walkthrough, a practice he'd adopted to observe how visitors experienced the exhibitions without the influence of his official presence. It was his way of staying connected to the museum's mission of making art accessible to everyone. The Renaissance wing was his masterpiece. Every painting, every sculpture had been carefully selected and positioned to tell the story of one of history's most transformative artistic periods. The centerpiece was Botticelli's Portrait of a Young Woman, a piece he had personally negotiated to acquire from a private collector in Florence 3 years earlier. As Marcus approached the Botticelli, he noticed a small group gathered around a young tour guide who was enthusiastically addressing her audience. Sarah Mitchell, 26 years old, had been hired just 3 months earlier as part of the museum's new visitor engagement program. She was energetic, passionate about art, and eager to share her knowledge with visitors. "And here we have one of our most prized possessions," Sarah announced to her group, gesturing toward the Botticelli. This magnificent portrait was painted around 1485 and represents the height of Florentine Renaissance art. Marcus smiled slightly and moved closer, curious to hear how the new guide was presenting the piece he knew so intimately. "The subject of the painting," Sarah continued confidently, "is believed to be Simonetta Vespucci, who was considered the most beautiful woman in Florence. Botticelli was absolutely captivated by her beauty." Marcus frowned slightly. The information was partially correct, but contained a significant historical inaccuracy that he knew would mislead visitors about the painting's true significance. "The technique Botticelli used here," Sarah went on, "demonstrates the influence of Northern European painting styles, particularly in the way he handled the background landscape." This time, Marcus couldn't help but shake his head. The analysis was completely wrong. This particular work showed purely Italian Renaissance techniques with no Northern European influence whatsoever. A middle-aged woman in the tour group raised her hand. "Excuse me, but I read somewhere that this painting was acquired relatively recently. Do you know when the museum got it?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, clearly uncertain. "Oh, this piece has been part of our collection for decades. It's one of our foundational Renaissance works." Marcus stepped forward slightly, unable to remain silent any longer. The painting had been acquired just 3 years ago, and he had personally led the acquisition process. "Actually," Marcus said politely, "that painting was acquired in 2021. It's one of our more recent additions to the Renaissance collection." Sarah turned to look at him with irritation. A black man in casual clothes was interrupting her professional tour, and she wasn't pleased. "Sir," she said firmly, "I'm conducting a guided tour here. If you have questions, please wait until the end, or you can join one of our general admission tours." Marcus nodded patiently. "I apologize for interrupting. I was just hoping to clarify some historical details." I appreciate your interest, Sarah replied with barely concealed condescension, but I'm a trained museum professional. I think I know our collection pretty well. The tour group shifted uncomfortably, sensing tension in the exchange. Marcus decided to step back and observe, curious to see how the situation would unfold. He had encountered dismissive attitudes before, but never quite so blatantly in his own museum. Sarah continued her presentation, moving to the next painting. This Raphael, she announced, shows the artist's mastery of perspective and his innovative use of chiaroscuro. Marcus winced. The painting was actually by a lesser-known student of Raphael, not the master himself, and the chiaroscuro technique she was describing was more characteristic of Caravaggio, who came much later. The commission for this piece, Sarah went on, came directly from Pope Julius II, who was Raphael's most important patron. Again, completely incorrect. The painting had been commissioned by a wealthy Florentine merchant family, not the Pope. Marcus found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. As the chief curator, he felt responsible for ensuring that visitors received accurate information about the collection. But as a black man in casual clothes, he had clearly been dismissed as someone whose opinion didn't matter. He approached Sarah again after she finished discussing the misattributed Raphael. "Excuse me," Marcus said gently, "but I think there might be some confusion about that last painting. It's actually not by Raphael himself, but by his student Giovanni Santi." Sarah's face flushed with annoyance. "Sir, I really need you to stop interrupting my tour. You're disrupting the experience for our paying visitors." "I understand," Marcus replied calmly. "But accuracy is important when discussing art history. These details matter." "Look," Sarah said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "I don't know where you think you learned about art, but I have a master's degree in art history from Columbia. I've been trained by the museum's education department. I think I know what I'm talking about." The tour group was now watching the exchange with obvious discomfort. Some visitors began checking their phones or wandering away to look at other paintings. Marcus remained patient. "I'm sure your training is excellent. I was simply offering some additional perspective." "Additional perspective?" Sarah laughed dismissively. "From who? Did you take an art appreciation class at community college?" The comment hung in the air like a blade. Several members of the tour group exchanged shocked glances at the obvious prejudice in Sarah's assumption. Marcus felt the familiar sting of racial bias, but his voice remained steady. "Actually, I have a Ph.D. in Renaissance art history from Yale." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Right, and I suppose you're an expert on museum collections too." "As a matter of fact," Marcus said quietly, "I am." Before Sarah could respond, her radio crackled to life. "Sarah, this is Museum Control. Dr. Williams is conducting his monthly walkthrough today. Please be aware he may be observing exhibitions in casual dress." Sarah's hand moved to her radio, but she didn't respond immediately. The name seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Marcus reached into his wallet and pulled out his museum identification card. Dr. Marcus Williams, Chief Curator, Renaissance and Baroque Collections. Sarah stared at the ID, her face draining of color. The tour group pressed closer to see what was happening. "The Botticelli you were discussing," Marcus continued in the same gentle tone, "was acquired in 2021 through a negotiation I personally led with the Medici Foundation in Florence. It cost the museum $12.5 million. Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. "The painting you attributed to Raphael," Marcus went on, "is actually by Giovanni Santi, Raphael's father. It's a common confusion because of the similar techniques, but the historical record is quite clear. I wrote the museum's acquisition notes on that piece when we purchased it in 2019. The tour group was now completely silent, watching the encounter with fascination and second-hand embarrassment. The subject of the Botticelli, Marcus continued, isn't Simonetta Vespucci, though that's a common misconception. Based on recent scholarship and infrared analysis we commissioned, it's actually a portrait of Lucrezia Tornabuoni, Lorenzo de' Medici's mother. We published those findings in the Journal of Renaissance Studies last year. Sarah stood frozen, her face now completely red with humiliation. And the Northern European influence you mentioned, Marcus concluded, doesn't appear in this work. Botticelli's technique here is purely Florentine, representing the height of Italian Renaissance portraiture. One of the tour group members, an elderly gentleman, spoke up. "Dr. Williams, are you saying you're the curator of this entire wing?" Marcus nodded. "I've been the chief curator here for 15 years. I personally selected and acquired about 70% of the pieces you see in this room." A woman in the group raised her hand tentatively. "Doctor, would you be willing to tell us about some of the other paintings?" Marcus looked at Sarah, who was staring at the floor in mortification. "I think that's Ms. Mitchell's job. She's your assigned guide." "Please," another visitor chimed in. "We'd love to hear from you." Sarah finally found her voice. "Dr. Williams, I'm so sorry. I had no idea who you were. I thought—" "You thought what, exactly?" Marcus asked, not unkindly but with genuine curiosity. Sarah struggled to find words that wouldn't make the situation worse. I assumed, you weren't dressed like—" "Like what?" Marcus prompted gently. "Like someone who would know about art," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded slowly. "I see. And what does someone who knows about art look like?" The question hung in the air, forcing Sarah to confront the assumptions she had made based on his appearance and race. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "I realize now that I made terrible assumptions. I'm so embarrassed." Marcus turned to address the tour group. "Ladies and gentlemen, this actually presents us with an excellent teaching moment. Art has always been about challenging assumptions and seeing beyond surface appearances. That's what the Renaissance masters were trying to achieve. They wanted viewers to look deeper, to question what they thought they knew." He gestured toward the Botticelli. "When this portrait was painted, people looked at it and saw what they expected to see, a beautiful woman, probably a nobleman's wife or daughter. But the artist was actually making a statement about power, politics, and the role of women in Renaissance society. The real meaning was hidden beneath the surface." The tour group listened intently as Marcus began to explain the true stories behind the paintings. His knowledge was encyclopedic, but his presentation was accessible and engaging. He spoke about the historical context, the techniques, the political implications, and the human stories behind each work. Sarah stood to the side, watching in amazement as Marcus transformed what had been a routine tour into an extraordinary educational experience. She began to understand not just how wrong she had been about the facts, but how deeply she had misjudged the man himself. After 30 minutes of impromptu lecturing, Marcus concluded his presentation. "Ms. Mitchell, would you like to continue the tour from here?" Sarah shook her head. "Dr. Williams, I think you've given our visitors far more than I ever could. Thank you for sharing your expertise." The tour group applauded enthusiastically. Several visitors approached Marcus with additional questions, while others asked for recommendations about other parts of the museum to visit. As the group dispersed, Sarah approached Marcus privately. "Dr. Williams, I owe you a sincere apology. My behavior was unprofessional and inappropriate. I made assumptions based on your appearance, and that was wrong." Marcus studied her for a moment. "Sarah, may I ask you something?" "Of course." What made you assume I didn't belong here? Sarah took a deep breath. Honestly, you were a black man in casual clothes asking detailed questions, and I guess I assumed that someone like you wouldn't know about Renaissance art. It was racist, and I'm ashamed of myself. Marcus appreciated her honesty. The fact that you can acknowledge that shows character, but I want you to understand something important. Every day, people who look like me walk through these halls with knowledge, expertise, and passion for art. We're professors, curators, collectors, artists, and scholars. We belong in these spaces not because of how we dress or how we look, but because of our love for art and learning. You're absolutely right, Sarah said. How do I make sure this never happens again? Marcus considered the question. Education, not just about art history, but about your own biases. And remember that expertise doesn't have a specific appearance. Some of our most knowledgeable visitors are elderly women who've been studying art for decades. Some are young students who've read everything they can get their hands on. Some are auto mechanics who spend their weekends in museums. Knowledge belongs to everyone. 3 weeks later, Sarah requested a meeting with Marcus. She had enrolled in a diversity and inclusion workshop and had been working with the museum's education department to improve her presentation skills. Dr. Williams, she said, I wanted to thank you for handling that situation with such grace. You could have had me fired, but instead, you turned it into a learning experience. Marcus smiled. Sarah, my job isn't just to preserve and present art. It's to ensure that everyone feels welcome in this museum. That includes you, and it includes our visitors. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Sarah continued, about assumptions and looking deeper. It's made me a better guide, but more importantly, it's made me a better person. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's what great art does. It changes us. It challenges us to see the world differently. From that day forward, Sarah became one of the museum's most popular tour guides. She told the story of her encounter with Dr. Williams, with his permission, as a way to help other staff members recognize their own potential biases. And Dr. Marcus Williams continued his monthly walkthroughs, secure in the knowledge that his museum was becoming a place where everyone truly belonged, regardless of how they looked or what assumptions others might make about them. Because in the end, the greatest art reveals truth. And the truth is that brilliance, knowledge, and passion exist in every corner of humanity, waiting to be recognized by those wise enough to look beyond the surface.